The 9th century defined the foundations of the way that Europe and the British Isles would develop in distinctly separate ways. Christians from their earliest days in Britain had to find ways of adhering to their religious principles and practices in secret. I'm now standing at the eastern entrance of Whithorn Priory, established about AD 500 by St Ninian. This is one of the very first Christian settlements in the British Isles. It was founded before Columba went to Iona. St Ninian had learnt his Christianity on the continent, and it was based on Roman ways, but the priory was absorbed some 200 years later into the Northumbrian Celtic church tradition. Whithorn Priory is a good example of the location that Christians had to find out of the way, on an isolated promontory of land where they would be less likely to be disturbed during their meetings to practice their Christian faith. A similar example is this oratory at Dingle in County Kerry in Ireland. But with all the conflict and bloodshed of the intervening years, and the lessons learnt from the reconciliations and benevolently authoritative style of such as Constantine, Columba, Edwin, Offa and Egbert, many rich and poor alike wanted to find a way of life which could avoid being involved in the bloodshed. The Christian Church began to be seen by some as a means of opting out of the risks and uncertainties of their daily, worldly existence. And as a consequence, money began to be made available by the richer families to be spent on building secure places in which people could devote themselves to the service of God and adopt a dress code which would distinguish them as such. Gone were the days when oratories needed to be built in out-of-the-way places. In the 7th century, monasteries and priories began to be built on a much grander scale, like this one at Much Wenlock in Shropshire. The original buildings would have been wood. The stone buildings we see here were built in the 11th century. The monks and nuns came from a wide variety of community and family backgrounds. Some were good farmers and herdsmen. Others looked after the poor, the sick, and the elderly. The monks began to be looked on as service providers, and the most successful of them became well-respected pillars of their communities, dependent on the talents and skills each monk could bring to his monastery. But now they were welcome within their communities, and Christians no longer had to hide and meet in secret, out-of-the-way places. It has to be acknowledged that not everyone's motives were entirely wholesome or devoid of self-interest. The lives of some of the monks who chose religious orders included certain worldly indulgences which one would not expect to find in such establishments. But all the monasteries collected Peter's pence, the tax that was due to be forwarded to Rome. And in the main, the monasteries had become a positive force within the communities that they served. But monasteries were also being founded on the continent of Europe, and the Vatican was becoming a very rich and powerful institution, such that the papacy was beginning to attract the kind of character who was perhaps not best suited to that high office. The Celtic Church in the British Isles, despite the ruling of King Oswy at the Synod of Whitby, was still openly active, especially in Ireland, and the Celtic Church could see only too well what was happening to the papacy in Rome. In the Europe of these Anglo-Saxon times, there was a complete separation between the authority of the Church and the authority of the state. As far as Rome was concerned, the new monastic communities owed their religious allegiances entirely to the Pope, not to the king. And talk of Anglo-Saxon Europe brings us here to what used to be the centre of Mercia. And behind me, over there, are what's known locally as the Three Ladies of the Vale, the three spires of Lichfield Cathedral and its wonderful western facade. The Pope at the end of the 8th century, Leo III, watched the King of the Franks in northern Europe, Charlemagne, conduct a series of crusade-like military campaigns against the pagan peoples of Scandinavia. And Pope Leo thought that he could strengthen his influence over Europe's ecclesiastical affairs by crowning Charlemagne as King of Rome on Christmas Day 800. And so it was that under Charlemagne's evangelical style of compulsory Christianity or death, the Holy Roman Empire began to take shape as a collection of little kingdoms, similar to those in Britain, each of whom, as members of that empire, would swear allegiance to a pope who would have absolute control over everything ecclesiastical, while each of the little kings would make their own decisions over their own secular affairs. But this separation of powers between church and state was never properly established in Britain. As far as the kings and the people of Britain were concerned, the affairs of both church and state in the little kingdoms of Britain were bound together, vested in the person of the king, elected and advised by the Witan, who would be made aware of the choice of the diocesan chapter for any vacant ecclesiastical office. And at the same time, Charlemagne knew that Britain was converting to Christianity at a pace he could approve of, without needing to resort to any military intervention. The pagan King Penda of Mercia had been killed in battle in 653 by Oswy of Northumbria, but his son, Peda, had married Oswy's daughter, and with his brother Wulfhere, who would later succeed him, had converted to Christianity, and their statues are included here, along with Offa and the other Christian kings who have made a significant contribution to the British Christian heritage. King Offa of Mercia was the most powerful of the British kings at the time of Charlemagne. As King of Mercia, he had also subjugated all of Kent and Wessex. So except for the land north of the River Humber, Northumbria, Offa's power extended over most of England, and certainly his influence extended onto the continent and into Charlemagne's court. His kingdoms, however, were still administered separately. Trade between Britain and Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries was flourishing, to the extent that, as was the custom of the day, Charlemagne suggested to Offa that one of his daughters should marry Charlemagne's son. Offa, in his turn, suggested that one of Charlemagne's daughters should marry his son Egfrith as well. But Charlemagne's response to that couldn't have been clearer. He closed all of the Frankish ports to British ships. Trade was only resumed after mediation by church and other leaders after a considerable period of time. At that time, the kingdoms of Kent, Wessex, Sussex and Mercia were, like Northumbria, all still separate, although Offa was accepted also as the King of Kent, in which the monastery and religious centre of Canterbury had been founded. Offa wanted to cement his influence in his own kingdom of Mercia by dividing into two the province of Canterbury, which would then serve Kent, Sussex and Wessex, and a new province of Lichfield, which would serve his principal power base of Mercia. In 787, after arguably duplicitous negotiations involving both Charlemagne and Pope Adrian I, Offa finally got his Archbishop of Lichfield. Unfortunately for Offa, it wouldn't last more than a decade after his death. The Pope was to re-establish the larger province of Canterbury, and thus it has remained ever since. A church has existed here at Lichfield since 669. A cathedral was built here shortly after the Norman conquest, and this structure dates from the 14th century. Its design clearly reflects the Roman ways, which, as we shall see, had been firmly established by that time. The last of the English kings represented on the western facade is Richard II, who reigned from 1377 to 1399, but most of the cathedral structure was built during the reign of his predecessor, Edward III, and the cathedral has been in constant use ever since. It's interesting that the statues across the front reflect the contribution of each of the kings. Paida was the first Christian king of Mercia, and he's holding a large crucifix. Offa is guarding the Archbishop's mitre. And King Alfred, who we'll look at in detail in a moment, is playing a musical instrument.